Olá, você vai acompanhar hoje mais um Sport TV Repórter especial de fim de ano. Nesta edição, trazemos uma investigação sobre um tema polêmico. Qual é o papel da genética no surgimento de um campeão? O DNA é o responsável pelo sucesso de um atleta? Existe talento? Nossa correspondente em Nova York, Karen Duarte, entrevistou o americano David Epstein, autor do livro O Gene do Esporte. Epstein reuniu as pesquisas científicas mais recentes sobre o assunto e tenta responder a essa antiga questão. Ele procurou saber até que ponto um bom desempenho no esporte se deve ao treinamento ou ao talento natural. Do sucesso dos corredores africanos ao biotipo característico de cada esporte, acompanhe as conclusões dessa discussão fascinante. A influência dos genes no desempenho esportivo é um universo a ser descoberto.
Jamaica e Quênia não são países grandes. A Jamaica é menor que Sergipe, o menor estado do Brasil. O Quênia é do tamanho da Bahia. Mas quando se trata de Jogos Olímpicos, os dois são potências mundiais. No mesmo esporte, o atletismo. Mas em duas modalidades totalmente diferentes. As corridas de velocidade, no caso da Jamaica, e as de longa distância, no caso do Quênia. Graças ao atletismo, a Jamaica ficou em 18º lugar no quadro de medalhas de Londres, à frente de países como Espanha e Brasil. E o Quênia terminou no 28º lugar, diante de nações bem mais ricas, como o Canadá, Suíça e Suécia. Há muitos anos, os especialistas suspeitam que o sucesso de alguns povos em determinados esportes se deve ao DNA. O tema é polêmico porque resvala na questão do racismo. Durante muito tempo, isso atrasou a pesquisa sobre a influência dos genes no desempenho esportivo. Nos últimos anos, vários estudos revelaram que a genética tem um papel maior do que se acreditava na formação de campeões. Um novo livro, The Sports Gene, O Gene do Esporte, reúne o resultado de pesquisas mais recentes. Seu autor é o jornalista americano David Epstein, repórter especial da revista esportiva mais tradicional do mundo, a Sports Illustrated. Epstein mostra como, à medida que o Homo sapiens se dispersou por todos os continentes, pequenas mutações genéticas ao longo dos séculos levaram a diferenças físicas entre os povos. Essas diferenças parecem explicar por que os jamaicanos, descendentes de escravos trazidos da África, são os mais rápidos do mundo e por que os quenianos de uma única tribo, os Kalenjin, são hoje os melhores maratonistas do planeta. Os Kalenjin vêm do Vale do Rift, uma província do Quênia. Embora sejam apenas cerca de 5 milhões, já conquistaram mais de 70 medalhas olímpicas no atletismo. Segundo uma estatística citada no livro de David Epstein, 80 de cada 1 milhão de quenianos têm potencial genético para ser um corredor de longa distância de nível mundial. No resto do mundo, essa proporção é de 1 para cada 20 milhões. Ou seja, os quenianos teriam 1.700 vezes mais potencial que outros povos para esse tipo de prova. Mas Epstein também mostra que isso não é uma espécie de determinismo racial. Afinal, se os quenianos são tão imbatíveis, como explicar os triunfos do brasileiro Marilson dos Santos na Maratona de Nova York? Como explicar os recordes da maratonista britânica Paula Radcliffe? São perguntas que o jornalista tenta responder no seu novo livro.
Sort of came out of my own athletic experiences, starting with high school, where I lived outside Chicago, and there was kind of a mini Jamaican diaspora to my hometown. And we had all these Jamaican runners that made track and field really popular at my school, and we always beat everyone. And I sort of wondered where all, from this tiny island, how could all these great sprinters be coming from that tiny area? And I moved up in running longer distances, running against Kenyans in college, and realizing that while I thought, Kenyans were all great distance runners, it was really these guys from one tiny tribe in Kenya called the Kalenjin tribe. And I really just started to sort of wonder what was going on and wanted to explore my own questions about the nature and nurture of athleticism. One of those Jamaican men who I ran track with in high school who was kind of the first of his immigrant family who was going to go to college. He had been a state champion in track and field, and he dropped dead a couple steps after a race. And I wanted to find out what happened. So I had his family sign a waiver so I could gather up all of his medical records. And it turned out he had a disease that's caused by one tiny change in the DNA that causes your heart muscle cells to be built wrong. And that's almost always the cause of sudden death in athletes. They often have no prior symptoms. They don't know what's going to happen. And that really propelled me into sports science writing in general.
Por que algumas pessoas são viciadas em praticar esportes e outras simplesmente não conseguem se exercitar com regularidade? A resposta pode ter a ver com a dopamina, substância química que ajuda a transmitir mensagens entre as células do sistema nervoso. Estudos mostram que pessoas que têm uma variante de um determinado gene têm mais chance de se viciar em exercício. É o que explica o livro de David Epstein.
So what was the most surprising thing you found out, like in the beginning, when you started researching about this?
I would say, well, so there's a section where I write about people's genetic drive to train, basically, and I knew that the dopamine system in the brain, which is involved in our sense of pleasure and reward that we feel for things like eating, drugs, sex, all those things, that responds to when we exercise, that it changes how we feel. But I didn't know there was so much scientific documentation showing that the reverse is true, that based on our individual biology in our brain, it determines how willing we are to exercise and to train. So there are a lot of factors, obviously, desire for money, desire for glory, but differences in people's brain chemistry actually make some people feel a compulsive drive to train, and that was something that was sort of unexpected for me.
David Epstein resume uma antiga discussão no esporte com uma expressão em inglês: nature or nurture. Em português, natureza ou criação. Até que ponto a excelência no esporte se deve ao talento natural? Até que ponto se deve ao treinamento árduo? Um soco de Muhammad Ali leva 40 milésimos de segundo para atingir um adversário. Para desviar de um golpe desses, só um boxeador muito treinado. No beisebol, para quem vê de fora, parece fácil acertar a bolinha, mas não é. Ela leva apenas 400 milésimos de segundo para viajar da mão do arremessador ao taco do rebatedor, a uma velocidade de 150 km por hora. O olho humano leva 75 milésimos apenas para reconhecer a bola no momento do arremesso. A janela para acertar a bola é de apenas 5 milésimos de segundo. Não basta ter reflexos apurados. É preciso, de certa forma, adivinhar onde a bola vai chegar.
Olha só o lançamento pro Messi, tem a chance do gol, bateu! Gol!
E o sucesso de Lionel Messi no futebol se deve a um desempenho atlético excepcional ou à capacidade de antever uma jogada, de se posicionar no lugar certo na hora certa? Dois pesquisadores americanos batizaram de chunking a capacidade de ver o que os outros não veem. A palavra vem do inglês chunk, pedaço, fatia. Em vez de analisar o lance por inteiro, o atleta genial agrupa as informações em fatias. Isso permite uma análise mais rápida, uma fração de segundo que no esporte pode ser decisiva. E isso não se consegue apenas com genes favoráveis. Exige milhares de horas de treinamento.
How much is more important sometimes than like genetics or training or...
Well, it's not totally separate because we know that some people sort of, this ability to predict the future is what all elite athletes rely on, right? So it's not necessarily that Messi is faster or stronger than the other guys out there, but he sees the field in a different way, using what I refer to in the book as chunking, which is he's practiced in such a way for so long a time that he can group information on the field in a way that allows him to sift through information incredibly quickly. And that is what separates elite athletes from novice athletes, even more so than just sort of their raw athleticism.
Alguns estudos avaliam que são necessárias 10.000 horas de treinamento para atingir a excelência, seja no esporte, seja para se tornar um cirurgião altamente qualificado, seja para brilhar nos palcos do mundo como Joshua Bell, um mestre do violino.
The 10,000 hours, which has become this sort of rule of thumb idea that if you practice for 10,000 hours, you'll become elite in whatever you do, whether you're a surgeon, a musician, an athlete. But it really comes from a tiny study of violinists. 30 violinists who were so highly pre-screened that they had already gained entry into a world-famous music academy. So this study can say nothing about talent because it's already screened to the very talented few. And in that group, the 10 best had averaged about 10,000 hours of practice by the age of 20. But there were differences between them. 10,000 hours was just an average. So in the book, I tell a story of two high jumpers who meet at the World Championships. One who had about 20,000 hours of practice, one who had about 0 hours of practice. And the guy with 0 hours wins the World Championship. So those two average 10,000, but that's really meaningless. And I think that sort of shows that the range is what's important, not the average.
O choque entre treinamento e genética encontra lugar em muitas histórias, como a da imbatível supremacia africana no atletismo, ou a da mulher que descobriu, por acaso, aos 27 anos, uma característica incomum que faria dela uma das melhores atletas de Ironman de todos os tempos. Se tivessem sido aplicados testes genéticos a eles, seria possível descobrir antes esse talento?
É possível fazer testes genéticos que determinem a aptidão física para esse ou aquele esporte. Alguns genes já foram identificados. Eles mostram, por exemplo, como uma pessoa reage a treinamentos de longas distâncias. Mas, muitas vezes, são vários os genes ligados às características que influenciam na aptidão atlética. E, até hoje, os testes ainda não substituíram o olhar clínico de treinadores e preparadores físicos na busca de um futuro campeão.
So I did a genetic test and it found that I have genes that predict that I would be a very high, fast responder to endurance training, that I would get very good very quickly if I do endurance training. And that's exactly what happened to me in my own career when I was a college track runner. I would train with a guy who was much more highly recruited than me. He would start the season in good shape. I would start the season in bad shape, and we would do the same exact workouts every day, and I would surpass him fairly quickly. So I'm now what scientists call a high responder, and that's in part due to my genes. Because I went from being very, very slow to being quite fast. My training partner, who was doing the exact same thing I was doing, stride for stride, day after day, we lived together, we trained together, he started out well and hardly improved at all. So they would say, oh, he has psychological problems because he's not improving well. We were doing the same training. So when I look back on this, I see this just as we had different gifts. Whereas he started with good endurance and improved very little. I didn't start with much, but I had genes that made me respond very well to training.
Should we believe in talent?
I absolutely think we should believe in talent, because what happens when we don't is we force kids to hyper-specialize in sports, for example, and that does them a disservice. So what sports scientists now see is the route to elite athleticism is allowing young athletes to sample a range of sports and to find the sports that best fit their genetics and the kind of training that best fits their genetics, and that's how they can get as far as they can in a particular sport. So we think of someone like Steve Nash, the basketball player, one of the most skilled basketball players who ever lived. His first love was soccer. He didn't get a basketball until he was 13 years old. So the idea that we should just funnel everyone to the same sport because it's only a matter of practice really does a disservice to some athletes. So one of the main characters in one of the chapters is Chrissie Wellington, who's the greatest female Ironman triathlete of all time. She didn't even sit on a road bike until she was 27 years old. She discovered her talent when she was in the Himalayas doing environmental development work and noticed that she could bike alongside the Sherpas, the people who escort travelers up Mount Everest, and that she was fine at 15,000 feet. And she came back and won the World Championships. And she became a great philanthropist, too. And so her message in the book is, don't be afraid to try something new. You might find a hidden talent. The sports science now says that being exposed when you're younger, clearly you have to specialize usually in the teen years, but when you're younger, being exposed to multiple, what scientists call attacking sports, which would be like football or American football or basketball, even to some degree volleyball, even though people don't cross the midline, is you gain these perceptual skills that allow you to anticipate what's going to happen, to use body cues to know where people are going, to use flights of the ball to know where it's going before it gets there. And that is what allows elite athletes to not be stuck reacting to a sport. And the fact is, elite athletes don't have any faster reaction time than normal people. I tested faster on a reaction time test than did some of the greatest Major League Baseball hitters. So it's really their ability to perceive the game that comes from these learned skills, not their ability to react to it. Based on what sports scientists know, I think there are two main reasons that you see some kids will pick up motor skills much more quickly than others. One is that they've been exposed to more sports and athletic activities, and they learn a body awareness that helps them pick up any motor skill more quickly. They don't have to have been specialized in that motor skill. Second is we're now finding genes, we know what some of them are, that are involved in chemical messaging in the brain that make some people more likely to learn a skill quickly and to not repeat the same mistakes that they made on the first try when they do it over and over. So like most things I write in the book, there's an element of training and exposure to skills, and now we're also starting to find some of the genetic elements to this.
Caso emblemático citado por David Epstein em seu livro é o de Donald Thomas, saltador das Bahamas. No Mundial de Atletismo de 2007, em Osaka, no Japão, Thomas conquistou o título do salto em altura, apesar de ter apenas 8 meses de treinamento na modalidade. Thomas não tinha uma técnica apurada, mas nasceu com um tendão de Aquiles excepcionalmente longo. O tendão comprido é uma grande vantagem para um saltador em altura, porque atua como uma mola. Donald Thomas soube usar essa mola para ganhar o título mundial.
The Achilles tendon is one that I highlight in the book because the Achilles tendon is basically a spring that runs along the back of your leg. And just like a normal spring, the bigger it is and the tighter it is, the more energy it can store. The higher you can jump, it helps with your sprinting. And there's nothing you can do about the length of your Achilles tendon. So I highlight a world champion in the book, a world champion high jumper, who found out that he was a great jumper on a bet at lunchtime. And it just turned out that he had this massive Achilles tendon. So it's like a huge spring. And when you compress it, you store a lot of elastic energy, and it rockets you back into the air. And there's nothing you can do to change the length of your Achilles tendon. It's just a function of the distance between your calf muscle and your heel bone. And there are a lot of things I highlight in the book that, while training can do a lot, it can't change everything. Like your muscle fiber type proportions. There are two main types of muscle. Fast twitch muscle fibers that contract really quickly, don't need oxygen to produce energy, and they tire out very quickly, and slow twitch, which are for marathon runners. They need lots of oxygen, they don't contract as violently, and you either have more of one or the other. So you can't have a marathoner and a 100-meter runner in the same body. You either are more predisposed to explosive events or to endurance events, or right in the middle. So that's how people sort of separate into their events, because training doesn't make those slow twitch muscle fibers become fast twitch muscle fibers. You have what you have. For swimming, what you want is a long torso and short legs. Michael Phelps is 6'4", and he wears the same size pants as the guy who's 5'9" and holds the world record in the mile, the Moroccan Hicham El Guerrouj. That really shows the range of body types and how, as sports have become more competitive, these increasingly specialized body types sort of find their niches in the sports world.
Set.
Nos Jogos de Londres, em 2012, os jamaicanos dominaram como nunca as provas rápidas. Usain Bolt levou o ouro nos 100 e nos 200 metros. Nas duas provas, outro jamaicano, Yohan Blake, ficou com a prata. E nos 200, a Jamaica pela primeira vez fez todo o pódio, graças ao bronze de Warren Wire. Muitos motivos para comemorar. Como era de se esperar, a supremacia jamaicana foi coroada com o ouro no revezamento 4 por 100 metros. E a Jamaica também ampliou seu domínio nas provas femininas. Nos 100 metros foi ouro com Shelly-Ann Fraser e bronze com Veronica Campbell-Brown. Outros países do Caribe brilham nas corridas de velocidade. Kirani James, da minúscula ilha de Granada, venceu os 400 metros em Londres. No revezamento 4 por 400 metros, foi o arquipélago das Bahamas que levou o ouro. Nas provas de resistência, quem abocanha a maior parte das medalhas são os países do leste da África. A maratona dos Jogos de Londres foi vencida por Stephen Kiprotich, de Uganda, seguido por 2 africanos. No feminino, a Etiópia levou o ouro nos 5.000 e 10.000 metros. E na maratona, com 3 atletas diferentes: Meseret Defar, Tirunesh Dibaba e Tiki Delana. Os jamaicanos, tão rápidos, desaparecem nas provas longas. Os quenianos e etíopes, tão resistentes, ficam para trás nas distâncias curtas. O que explica essas diferenças? No caso dos jamaicanos, a explicação pode ser histórica. Grande parte dos velocistas da Jamaica vem da mesma região, o noroeste da ilha, onde, no século XVIII, um grupo de escravos, os Maroons, enfrentou o exército britânico e conquistou à força a própria liberdade. Os descendentes desse grupo teriam os genes certos para as provas de velocidade. Usain Bolt, Veronica Campbell-Brown e até Ben Johnson, canadense de origem jamaicana, que foi desclassificado por doping nos Jogos de Seul em 1988.
When I went to Jamaica, the people there told me this sort of folklore, that there's this group of warrior slaves who had beaten back the British army and they won their freedom 100 years before official emancipation, and they went and set up a civilization in the northwest of the island. And that's where Usain Bolt is from, and Veronica Campbell-Brown, and all the great sprinters. Even Ben Johnson's from, descends from that area. And so they said, well, it was these fierce warriors, and them breeding together made these great sprinters. But the DNA evidence doesn't really support that. They look just like all the other Jamaicans. But what Jamaica does have is it has a population of people from a very specific area of West Africa. So in every Olympic 100-meter final, every man who's been in one since the boycotted games of 1980, whether his homeland is the United States, Canada, Jamaica, Netherlands, Portugal, Nigeria, every single one has his ancestry in a small area of West Africa. Just a small area. It doesn't matter where his homeland is. And that area has among the highest malaria prevalence in the world. And in the book, I discuss evidence that adaptation that made people more resistant to malaria caused a shift to more fast-twitch muscle fibers that has caused people from that area of West Africa to have, just on average, not every person, but on average, more fast-twitch muscle fibers than people from other parts of the world. And you take those people, you put them in Jamaica, which is a sprint-crazy place, where a 6'4", 15-year-old, which is what Usain Bolt, instead of being pushed to the basketball court or the volleyball court, can be pushed to the track. And then I think you get what we see on the track today with Jamaicans. There are other Usain Bolts out there right now. So at the very end of the book, I write about the evidence that there is no perfect athlete, really. We don't have enough people to have gotten somebody with all the right genes. So we have to keep rolling the dice and making babies to make our chances better of having the perfect athlete. There are other Usain Bolts out there, I guarantee it. But on what other country, other than maybe Jamaica, Trinidad, and the Bahamas, would a 6'4", 15-year-old who can sprint be pushed toward the track instead of to basketball or American football or football? It's really Usain Bolt himself tried to play soccer and then cricket. Only in Jamaica would somebody have grabbed him by the ear basically and said, no, you're going to run track. So I'm sure there are others out there that we aren't identifying. Talent search and talent transfer absolutely works, and we've seen that when Australia was awarded the Olympics. They had the 2000 Olympics. They started a talent search when they won the right to host the Olympic Games, and it paid off in gold medals like crazy. At their home Olympics, they won, relative to their population, they won 10 times as many medals as the United States relative to our population, and that's because they went and looked at sports and said, hey, you're pretty good at this sport, but your body type really fits this other sport. So they started shifting people between sports. One of the most famous examples was Alyssa Camplin, who ended up winning a gold medal at a later Winter Olympics in the aerials, you know, like the flipping in the air off the ski ramp. She had done a bunch of other sports. They liked her athleticism and body type. She won the gold medal in aerials. Hardly knew how to ski still. She fell on the way down the mountain to her press conference afterward and tripped and crushed her flowers while she was going to get the gold medal for a skiing event. England did the same thing with talent search. The first gold medalist for the home team in the English Olympics was Helen Glover, a rower. She had started rowing 4 years earlier when somebody came and measured her and said, boy, you have long legs and you're going to be really tall. Come row. Now she's a gold medalist. Fitting the right bodies into the right sports absolutely works whenever a home team does it and they host the Olympics. So Brazil should do it. Well, there has to be some money allocated to it, as they did in Australia. And then I think you combine coaches and sports scientists, because the coaches can see some things the scientists can't see, and the scientists can absolutely measure things that the coaches won't know to look for. I don't think you need it in a sport like football, because it's already the country's most popular sport. So there you have the natural talent funnel. Everybody tries, and only the best will survive. But in any sport that's not the country's most popular sport, like for American football, we don't need a talent search. It happens on its own. But for every other sport, we need it. The popularity of the 10,000 hours rule has caused people to push kids into early, what's called hyper-specialized training, where they'll start one sport at a really young age, 4 or 5 years old, and they'll just do that. And there's evidence that that helps in some sports, like gymnastics and golf. But in most other sports, the evidence is that it's either not necessary or it can even be detrimental. So you want young athletes to be exposed to a sport and have a significant amount of practice, and not just practice, but good practice, where they focus on correcting their errors. But really, most of the evidence is that the path that most elite athletes take is they sample sports through about age 12, unless it's golf or gymnastics. Then they focus in after that really on one sport, and then it's important for them to get very specific practice with specific coaching.
Há uma década, o genoma humano foi mapeado. E desde então são buscadas as fórmulas que constroem um atleta de sucesso. Se a discussão é a genética de um vencedor, muito se fala sobre o tipo de corpo. Ginastas são baixinhas, nadadores têm o tronco grande, correto? Você vai ver que esse fator segue uma lógica um pouco mais complexa.
Como descobrir qual o esporte certo para praticar? Em alguns casos, a escolha não é difícil. Para um nadador, ajuda a ter braços e tronco alongados e pernas curtas. É o caso do americano Michael Phelps, maior medalhista olímpico de todos os tempos. Para um campeão de longa distância, pernas mais longas, com quase nenhuma panturrilha, economizam esforço na hora de correr. Um exemplo é o marroquino Hicham El Guerrouch, campeão olímpico e recordista mundial da milha. Em seu livro, David Epstein pega um exemplo curioso. Um dos mais famosos desenhos de Leonardo da Vinci. O homem vitruviano, como é chamado, é o homem de proporções perfeitas. Segundo Vitrúvio, um arquiteto da Roma Antiga, a envergadura dos braços de um homem é exatamente igual à sua altura. Mas no esporte nem sempre essa é a regra. No basquete, o homem vitruviano seria um fracasso. Estudos mostram que praticamente todos os jogadores da NBA, a Liga Profissional Americana, têm envergadura maior que a própria altura. Estrelas como LeBron James e Dwayne Wade têm braços desproporcionalmente longos. Anthony Davis, outro jogador da NBA, tem 2,08 metros de altura. mas seus braços são de um homem de 2,26 metros. Mas não adianta medir as proporções do seu filho ou fazer testes genéticos para saber se ele vai se tornar um campeão. Como David Epstein explica em seu livro, cada pessoa reage de forma diferente aos treinamentos. E é justamente a combinação entre a aptidão genética e o prazer em treinar que formam um campeão.
There's a little grain of truth in the idea that practicing for gymnastics will keep you from getting tall. So actually, as I write in the book, elite female gymnasts, because of the increasing specialization in the last 30 years, their average height has shrunk from 5'3" to 4'9". And that's largely because they're selecting for smaller people because they can spin in the air better. But the kind of training they do does delay their growth spurt sometimes. But it doesn't delay their eventual height. They still reach the normal height that they would have reached, but it does delay it while they're doing that training. But if they do, on the occasions when they do start to hit their growth spurt, like, that's it. They can't do gymnastics anymore. So it self-selects them out. That's what happened to Yelena Isinbayeva, who is, you know, one of the greatest track and field athletes of all time, the world record holder in the women's pole vault. She was a pretty good gymnast. And then she had a growth spurt. They said, sorry, you're done. So they had to push her to pole vault. Lucky for her. Playing the sports that value height has no influence on your adult height at all. So that actually has been studied, and there was some thinking that it might be the opposite, like too much jumping and weightlifting might cause you to be shorter as an adult, but there's no truth to that either way. So playing those sports doesn't affect your eventual height at all. There's so much that we still don't know. I mean, Sir Roger Bannister, who was the first man to break 4 minutes in the mile, and a world-famous neurologist, said decades ago that the integration of heart, lungs, and muscle that the athlete performs is far too complex for the physiologist to analyze. And that's still true. It's still, the human machine still performs this integration that is so seamless that it's quite difficult to analyze, but we're getting there. So 10 years ago when we sequenced the human genome, and people thought maybe overnight we would know everything about genetics, well, 10 years later, we still have a lot of huge questions, but we're finally getting somewhere. I don't think we'll ever get all the way there because elite athletic performance is a combination of genetics, of experience, of access to coaching and psychological drive. But for the first time, we're starting to know what some of the genes that play into that soup are.
Paula Radcliffe, a recordista mundial da maratona, não é queniana nem etíope. Nasceu na Inglaterra. Mas ela é um exemplo de como a teoria sobre a superioridade genética dos africanos para corridas de longa distância é simplista. Paula é bem mais alta que suas rivais africanas. Magra, com pernas muito longas, ela tem o corpo perfeito para a maratona. Com uma ressalva: a altura prejudica o desempenho de Paula em dias de muito calor. Quanto menor o corredor, mais rápido o calor do corpo se dissipa. Essa capacidade de dissipar o calor é fundamental para correr por mais de 2 horas. Isso explicaria por que Paula Radcliffe fracassou nas maratonas olímpicas de Atenas em 2004 e Pequim em 2008, embora fosse a favorita.
A Paula Radcliffe parou. Parou a Paula Radcliffe.
Chorando.
Chorando, não suportou. Ela que tem a melhor marca até hoje, 2 horas 15 minutos e 25 segundos. Chora desesperada. Paula Radcliffe, a favorita da prova, agora tenta seguir.
As duas maratonas foram disputadas em dias de temperatura e umidade elevadas. Ou seja, numa mesma prova, em condições diferentes, a genética que ajuda pode atrapalhar.
I was going to ask about this psychological side. We had like a famous episode in Brazil's feminine volleyball, where in the World Championship, they were winning 24-19 over the Russian team, and like it was like 1 point to win the championship, and they lost, and they like we don't know. We always say, oh, we in Brazil have an expression that say you got like yellow.
Okay.
Like I don't know how to say it here, but like you
We would call that choking.
Choking.
That they choked.
Yeah,
so
they choked.
there's no way they could have lost, and they
Yeah.
managed to lose anyway.
And there was like a blackout, and they just forgot how to play in
Yeah.
these last 6 points. So how important is like your brain in these situations?
So what usually happens when someone chokes, or I guess gets yellow, to use the expression, is they take a skill. When we learn a skill, anything, riding a bike, dribbling a soccer ball, it starts in the front of your brain called the prefrontal cortex. And that's the area that's very human, involved in all the things that like separate us from other animals. And you have to think about what you're doing. Like if you remember first learning to drive a car, you had to think about everything you were doing. But as you get skilled, it moves back to these more primitive areas of your brain. So now you can drive a car without thinking. You can talk on your cell phone or whatever you want to do while you're doing it, unless something unexpected happens. That's called automating a skill. And when players get nervous, they de-automate the skill. They take it from the back of their brain and they move it back into this part where they're thinking. And that's what makes you act like an amateur, where instead of doing something automatically, you're stopping and thinking about every move. And that is the essence of choking. It happens in the prefrontal cortex. That's why coaches call timeouts, literally to try to make players think about something, so that hoping that they'll choke. You can train for it not to happen. There's a psychologist at the University of Chicago who trains with athletes to prevent getting yellow. And what she's found that some of the things that work is she works with golf putters a lot. And she'll find that telling them to sing in their head or to count backwards in their head while they're doing the putting will prevent the choking, because it occupies the thinking part of their brain and moves the skill back to the expert part. Each of us has an incredibly unique genome. Even brothers and sisters are very genetically different. And just as no two of us respond to medicine the same way, no two of us respond to training the same way. Every one of us, for optimal athletic development, would have a totally unique training plan. So I think the challenge of developing yourself as an athlete, or even as a recreational exerciser, is finding the training plan that gets the best out of you, and not sticking to something if you notice it's not working as well for you as it is for the next person. I can speak for myself, because I measured my own aerobic capacity and my endurance when I was a runner, and I was a better distance runner running 30 miles a week of training that was personalized for me than I had been running 85 miles a week of just distance. So to me, participating in training or exercise is a biological exploration of yourself that's beyond even the greatest science. And we should all remember that we're unique, and so the best plan for us is unique. Changed so many of my conceptions about sports. One of the big ones being that just like medical genetics showed that because of gene differences, if I take one Tylenol, it has a different effect than if you take one Tylenol. We're seeing the same thing with exercise. Talent isn't just how good someone is before they start training. It's the genetic setup that allows them to profit from training. And that made me reevaluate my own athletic career. I was tested for genes that show that I respond very well to endurance exercise.
Ainda há muito a descobrir no campo da genética ligada ao esporte. À medida que as pesquisas avançam, descobrem-se novos genes que influenciam uma ou mais características de um atleta. Os países que não investirem neste tipo de pesquisa correm o risco de ficarem para trás no quadro de medalhas de futuras Olimpíadas. Mas Epstein demonstra em seu livro que já sabe o bastante para afirmar: no futuro, será impossível ser um campeão sem a combinação certa do DNA adequado com muito treinamento.